Hi, my name is Callan. The day my own brother looked across the signing table and said, "I'm the new boss. You're just the help." Something inside me went cold. My father didn't defend me. He leaned in and whispered the words that hurt more than any lie. "You're the biggest loss of my life." They thought I was finished. They thought I'd been pushed aside, stripped of my place, my voice, my worth. What they didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that weeks earlier, I had quietly bought the very company they were trying to steal from me. And the fake bank statement my brother was about to submit. That single piece of paper would put my entire family in my hands. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stop the signing. I just let them finish and waited for the moment silence stopped protecting them. I arrived before anyone else, which was nothing new. Early had always felt safer. Fewer eyes, fewer chances to be told where I belonged. The conference room was already prepared. Glass walls caught the morning light and scattered it across the polished table. Neatly stacked folders waited at each place setting, their tabs color-coded, their edges perfectly aligned. Someone had gone to great trouble to make the room look decisive, final. I paused just inside the doorway and let the silence settle. The table had 6 chairs pulled in. One more sat slightly back, not pushed all the way under, angled just enough to suggest hesitation, as if someone had reached for it, then thought better of it. I took my place near the wall instead. Standing felt more honest than claiming a seat I hadn't been offered. I rested my hand against the back of a chair that wasn't mine and watched the city move through the glass. Cars stopped and started at the light below. People walked with purpose, coffee cups in hand, faces already set for whatever the day planned to ask of them. Inside the room, time felt suspended. The documents on the table waited like witnesses. When the door opened again, the room changed temperature. Rourke came in talking, his voice filling the space before his body did. He wore a tailored jacket and a smile that assumed agreement, the kind of smile that didn't check whether it was welcome. "Morning," he said, as if we'd been waiting for him, which we had. He took the center seat without breaking stride, tugged it closer, spread his folders in front of him like he owned the surface. No one challenged it. No one ever did. He didn't look at me at first. That came later. After the lawyers arrived. After my father followed. His expression set in that careful way he used when he'd already made up his mind. Darius nodded once at the table. Acknowledgement without warmth. He stood behind Rourke for a moment, hands resting on the chair like a claim. When he sat, it was beside him. Not across, not equal, aligned. My mother came in last, smoothing the front of her blouse, eyes already scanning for disorder. She chose a seat near the end, far enough away to avoid attention, close enough to stay informed. She didn't ask where I was sitting. She never did. The meeting began with polite noise. Greetings, comments about the weather, the city, traffic. Words that filled space without saying anything. I listened, nodded when expected, kept my hands visible. Still. Rourke leaned back and glanced around, pleased with the arrangement. Then his eyes landed on me. He tilted his chin, just a fraction. Enough to be noticed, enough to signal an audience. "You're just the help," he said. Not loud, not playful, certain. The room didn't laugh. It didn't react at all. That was worse. Silence wrapped around the words and let them settle, unchallenged, I felt heat rise behind my eyes, a familiar pressure I'd learned to manage long ago. I kept my face neutral and focused on my breathing. The chair near the table was still empty. My father cleared his throat, not to correct him, but to continue. He spoke about vision, about risk, about how Rourke had stepped up when it mattered. His gaze slid past me as if I were part of the furniture, useful, replaceable. I remembered other rooms, other tables, college dinners where my achievements went unmentioned, holidays where my seat was an afterthought, moments that taught me when to speak and when to disappear. I said nothing. The documents were passed around. Pages turned. Pens were placed with care. The process moved forward, efficient and precise. I noticed everything. The slight tremor in my father's hand when he reached for his pen. The way Rourke signed with a flourish, pressing hard enough to leave an impression on the page beneath. No one offered me the chair. I looked at it again, the way it stayed just out of reach, deliberately unused. It wasn't a mistake. It was a boundary. A message. I could have pulled it in. I could have sat. The thought crossed my mind and passed just as quickly. Not yet. I glanced at the documents from where I stood. The names, the numbers, the waiting signatures. They were so focused on what was in front of them that they missed what wasn't. Missed what I already knew. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside, my family mistook silence for absence. I stayed quiet at the table because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is let people believe they have erased you. I stayed quiet at the table, but silence doesn't mean absence. As the lawyers gathered their folders and the formal part of the meeting loosened, I felt eyes drift away from me. That was my cue. I let a small, polite smile settle on my face. Not warm, not apologetic, just enough to signal that I was fine, that I understood my place. The effect was immediate. Shoulders dropped. The air softened. People moved again. Rourke leaned back, satisfied, as if the room had passed a test. My father's posture eased the way it did when uncertainty left him. My mother glanced once at my expression, saw the smile, and returned her attention to appearances. The message was received, nothing to manage here. They mistook the smile for surrender. I let them. We filed out of the conference room in an unhurried stream. The hallway outside was bright and anonymous, all neutral carpeting and framed mission statements. A place designed to make conversations feel temporary and untraceable. Rourke walked a few steps ahead, already speaking again, his voice carrying without effort. "Once the paperwork clears, we'll clean up the figures," he said, casual as if he were talking about a scheduling change. Just a temporary adjustment. My father didn't hush him. He didn't slow him down. He nodded, once, the way men do when they've decided something unpleasant is necessary. I followed, matching their pace, my smile still in place. No one lowered their voice for me. Rourke stopped near the executive lounge, poured himself coffee, and continued. "It's not like anyone's going to dig that deep. This is just to get us through the gap." The words landed carefully, chosen for confidence rather than caution. I listened to how he framed it. Not as a lie, as a bridge, as if intention could replace accuracy. My father glanced toward me then, only briefly, and dismissed the thought just as quickly. "He won't get into it," he said. "This isn't his world." He said it kindly. That was the part that stung most. They talked about me like I was a closed door, something solid and present, but not worth opening. Decisions moved around me, over me, through me. I stood there, physically included, socially erased. When the others drifted away, my father slowed his steps and angled toward me. His voice dropped, not in secrecy, but in familiarity. "You should stay out of grown men's business," he said. "I'm trying to protect you." There was no anger in it, no cruelty, just certainty, the kind that leaves no room for response. I nodded once. The smile stayed. In that moment, something quiet ended. Not hope, I'd lost that years ago, but the habit of waiting for approval. I understood then that respect had never been part of the equation. Only usefulness. Only convenience. We returned to the lounge, and they resumed their conversation without checking whether I was listening. They spoke freely now, about timelines, about leverage, about how easy it was to move things when everyone agreed not to look too closely. I paid attention to everything, the phrasing, the confidence, the blind assumptions. I stopped measuring my words and started measuring theirs. When it was time to leave, Rourke clapped me on the shoulder, friendly and dismissive all at once. "Good to have you around," he said. "You keep things calm." I smiled again, smaller this time. I didn't warn them. I didn't correct a single statement. I didn't challenge the story they were telling themselves about who I was and what I knew. Let them be comfortable. They thought I didn't understand the numbers. That was their second mistake. By the time I got home that night, the sun had already dipped below the neighbors' rooftops. The drive back was quiet, long enough for the tension to harden into something sharper. Not rage, just precision. I didn't turn on any lights except the one above the kitchen table. Just that single glow against the dim. My briefcase landed with a soft thud on the table. I didn't even take off my coat. I pulled out the folders, the notebook I'd kept tucked in a sleeve, and opened my laptop. The room smelled faintly of yesterday's coffee and wood polish. This wasn't a war room. It was where I paid utilities, where I'd helped Mom with her prescriptions, where I once figured out how to refinance their mortgage, before Rourke stepped in and took credit for fixing everything. I sat down in the same seat I'd used for years, bill after bill, spreadsheet after spreadsheet, back when I wasn't even considered part of the business. They used to tell me I was better off away from the mess. "Stick to your own thing," Rourke said once when I asked why the expense lines never matched up. I was helping input invoices at the time. I remember the way he smiled like I'd made a joke. "You don't need to know how it works. You just keep things tidy." So I did. Tidy, quiet, helpful. I opened the folder from this morning's meeting. It wasn't labeled, which already told me something. Sloppy, confident, lazy. Inside were the executive summaries, financial projections, and merger outlines they'd all nodded over. I scanned the headers, let my eyes glide across the numbers like they were old friends showing new bruises. A margin percentage on page 3 didn't match the forecasted revenue on page 5. The amortization schedule was off by a quarter, and the cash flow table was recycled from a document dated last fiscal year, down to the same misaligned decimal. I didn't need to check twice. I'd seen that table before. I'd archived it myself when they gave me access to the old network for 1 week, 4 years ago. "Temporary access," Darius had said, "just so you can help sort files." I'd copied everything onto an encrypted drive and kept it. Not out of suspicion, out of instinct. I minimized the PDF and opened my local records. It didn't take long to find the original, labeled properly, signed by our former CFO before she resigned for personal reasons. They were using ghost numbers. I leaned back and exhaled through my nose. Not surprise, not even disappointment. just confirmation. For years, they treated my curiosity like it was inconvenient. Rourke hated when I asked, "Why does this line item fluctuate so much?" Or, "Who approves the quarterly vendor contracts?" Dad would say things like, "You think too much. This isn't academia. It's business." But that wasn't confidence. That was deflection. They weren't hiding brilliance. They were hiding shortcuts. I scrolled further. There it was, a forged document embedded in the appendix, subtle but enough to manipulate an investor with no reason to question. If they were planning to use this version with the bank, they were gambling on nobody tracing the line items back to their origins. I created a folder, labeled it Surface, dragged a few copies over, took screenshots with timestamps, backed it up to 2 locations, one online, one to an external drive I kept hidden in an old cigar box behind my bookshelf. I'd used that same box to hide my mother's insurance statements when Dad accidentally misplaced them years ago. I didn't call anyone, didn't send a single email. Silence, I'd learned, is loud when timed right. As I logged each discrepancy and cross-reference, I remembered another moment. Rourke laughing over drinks at a family barbecue. Callan's a good guy. He just doesn't have the stomach for real risk. Everyone laughed, even Mom, though she tried to cover it with a sip of wine. But here's the thing. Risk isn't about how loudly you take it. It's about how well you understand the consequences. I closed the laptop gently, sat there in the quiet. They never let me touch the numbers. Turns out, that's why they never saw me coming. By the time the papers were finalized, they believed I was out of the way. The next morning, while I was halfway through pouring my second cup of coffee, my phone lit up with my father's name. He never called in the morning. He wasn't the "how are you" type. If Darius Vale dialed, it meant something needed managing, and this time, apparently, I was the thing. I didn't let it ring twice. "Callan," he said, like we'd just spoken yesterday. Like things were easy. Got a minute? The tone was measured, the kind of rehearsed casual I'd heard him use on investors when a deal was going south. "Sure," I said. I didn't sit down. "What's up?" There was a pause, just long enough for me to hear the faint tap of his ring against the steering wheel. He was thinking, calculating. "I wanted to touch base," he started. "You've been around some conversations lately. Rourke's excited, and sometimes he overshares. You know how he is." I didn't answer. Dad continued as if that silence confirmed my understanding. "Look, this merger, it's big. It's delicate. There's no room for mixed signals right now." Still, I said nothing. He shifted. "I'm saying this as your father. Sometimes staying out of the middle of things is the best way to stay safe. Safe." There it was. He hadn't called to chat. He'd called to fold me in, quietly. Keep me contained. I walked to the sink, letting the faucet run just loud enough to think. When I turned it off, he was still waiting. "I appreciate the call," I finally said. Another beat passed, but he didn't hang up. "And listen," he added, voice tighter now. "There are a few documents, early drafts, that don't need extra eyes on them. You know how lawyers do. Rewrite things 10 times before it sticks." I could hear my own breathing in the pause. Steady. Cold. He didn't realize what he'd just admitted. Or maybe he did. And counted on my smile, again, to mean compliance. "I get it," I said. "Process can get messy." He exhaled, relieved. "Exactly. I'll catch up with you later." I hung up before he could respond. That afternoon, he sent a follow-up text. "Coffee tomorrow? My treat. Clean slate. I agreed. We met at a quiet cafe near the business district. I arrived second, by design. Darius was already seated in a corner booth, posture straight, coat draped neatly on the bench beside him. He'd chosen the angle deliberately, one entrance behind him, one in front. Visibility. Privacy. I'd seen him do the same thing at shareholder dinners when damage control was on the menu. He stood when I approached, gestured to the opposite seat. "Appreciate you coming," he said. No handshake, no eye contact longer than necessary. "Of course." We ordered coffee. Small talk was short-lived. He got to it quickly. "You've always been the smart one," he began. "And I know you see things most people miss." He sipped, watched me. "And that's why I wanted to remind you. Families don't survive exposure." He didn't blink. "It's not about hiding anything," he said. "It's about protecting what's already fragile. You know how easily trust breaks, especially public trust." He never said the word fraud. Didn't have to. What he meant was clear. Keep your mouth shut and you stay part of the family. Say something and you break it. "You think I'm trying to ruin something?" I said evenly. "I think you don't realize how much you could ruin." The way he leaned in, elbows on the table, chin slightly tilted. It wasn't anger. It was warning. Clean. Sharp. I glanced down at the cup between us. Half empty. Lukewarm. Like the bond we were pretending still meant something. "I was just sitting at the table," I said. "Didn't even have a chair." He didn't reply. We sat there for another minute, two men who no longer shared anything but blood. When I finally stood, he didn't reach for me, just looked past me to the door. He thought he was warning me. What he really did was tell me exactly when to stop protecting them. The next morning came with the same blue sky and sharp light that always makes downtown feel colder than it is. I arrived at the building a few minutes early, long enough to steady myself, long enough to watch Rourke's car pull up behind mine. He didn't see me standing just inside the lobby. He laughed at something on his phone, checked his teeth in the side mirror, then strode in like he owned the place. Maybe he believed he did. The receptionist greeted him by name. I followed silently, the automatic doors closing behind me like punctuation. The elevator ride was quiet, just us and the shallow hum of motion. Rourke didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge me at all. That was new. The conference room was already staged. Long, polished table, legal folders aligned with surgical precision, bottles of still water placed equidistant along the center line. I counted 12 name cards. None had mine. No one offered to fix it. No one apologized. Rourke took his seat at the head without hesitation, cracking his knuckles and smoothing his tie like he'd practiced this moment in the mirror. Probably had. Darius sat 3 chairs down, pen already in hand, flipping the pages of a thick contract like it was a breakfast menu. He didn't glance up. I stood off to the side, against the glass wall, a step outside the circle. It was intentional. Everything was. The legal rep introduced herself briskly, middle-aged, clipped voice, gray blazer over a black dress. "Let's get started," she said. "We'll walk through the key sections before signing." "Don't worry about him," Rourke cut in, nodding vaguely in my direction. "He's just observing. Standing's fine. He won't be here long." A few chuckles drifted around the room. Not loud. Just enough to confirm complicity. I didn't move. They thought making me invisible would make them more real. Darius never said a word. Not to me. Not in protest. He simply turned a page. I watched as they reviewed the clauses, highlighted the milestones, agreed on the incentives. It wasn't just a handover, it was a cleansing. Their narrative signed into permanence. The rep explained liability distribution. Rourke nodded like he understood. I knew he didn't. He never read footnotes. But he grinned wide when she mentioned refinancing the family estate to secure an aggressive capital bridge. Again, they were mortgaging the house. Again. And still, no one looked my way. They weren't hiding the terms. They assumed I couldn't interpret them. That was the most useful fiction of all. A beat passed before the lawyer slid the pen across the table toward Rourke. He straightened in his seat, squared his shoulders, and lifted the pen like a knight preparing to draw his sword. "Feels good to make it official," he said. His voice dipped in triumph. No one responded. Everyone was waiting for the signature, for the moment to become irreversible. And me? I didn't interrupt. Because in that silence, mine and theirs, I realized something more powerful than outrage. They'd built this whole performance assuming I would protest. They were prepared to manage resistance, not silence. If I said something now, I'd only confirm their framing, that I was unstable, emotional, clinging to a role I was never meant to play. But ghosts don't shout. They observe. They wait. They document. I kept still as the ink touched paper, watched as the first stroke turned into a signature, watched as the final page was passed around like a relic, everyone adding their mark to a version of the story they'd already rehearsed. No one ever noticed that the seat at the far end of the table, the one they'd left open, wasn't really empty. It was mine. They thought leaving me out meant I didn't exist. They forgot something important. Ghosts still see everything, confident the story was finished. That's when I started counting what they'd overlooked. The room emptied fast. Chairs scraped across hardwood. Laughter carried down the hallway like steam off a boiling pot. Fast, loud, evaporating just as quick. Nobody said goodbye. Nobody asked me to stay, which suited me just fine. I lingered a moment after the last handshakes and folder zipping. The overhead lights buzzed faintly. I looked at the pen still lying on the table, abandoned, capped, forgotten. The same one that had crowned Rourke's pageantry. Not worth stealing, but the timestamp it left behind? That couldn't be erased. I stepped into the hallway and turned left instead of right. Down past the elevators, past the kitchenette with the stale coffee pot and untouched scones, past where anyone had reason to watch. The compliance office sat quiet at the end of the corridor, tucked between storage and HR. I knocked once, not hard, and pushed the door open. A young woman behind the desk glanced up, more curious than annoyed. Her badge read, M. Henley. "Hi," I said evenly. "I was told to confirm that the submission packet went through this system. Can we check the digital trail on the funding statement for today's transaction?" Her eyebrows lifted slightly, just a blip. Then she nodded and swiveled to the second monitor. "Transaction ID?" I pulled my phone from my jacket, opened the photo I'd taken through the glass when the papers were handed over. "It's this one," I said, enlarging the image so the document number was clear. She typed. While we waited, I stayed silent. I didn't spin a story, didn't hint. I let the system do what systems are built to do. 2 minutes passed. Then she paused. "Do you know when this was submitted?" she asked. I kept my voice casual. "Should be today." "It wasn't," she said. "It was uploaded 6 days ago, from an external IP, not even through the internal network. That's uncommon." Her tone wasn't alarmed, not yet. Just neutral. She clicked again. It's a PDF. Metadata's showing a creation date of last Thursday. Modified the same day. Final submission Monday at 7:12 a.m. I nodded slowly. And it's marked as bank issued? That's what the header says, yeah. I didn't say what we both knew. Bank issued documents don't come as editable PDFs. She opened the file. The logo was crisp. Fonts perfect. Too perfect. What made you want to double check this? She asked. Something didn't feel right, I replied. Henley stared at the screen a second longer, then flagged the file in the system and typed a short note. She didn't ask my name, didn't need to. The process had begun. We'll escalate to internal review, she said. No one touches this file until that's done. I nodded once. Appreciate it. When I stepped back into the hallway, the carpet underfoot felt quieter than before. Not lighter, just muffled. The way things get when everything important has already started moving and there's nothing to do but let it roll. I didn't head straight for the elevators. Instead, I returned to the conference room. It was empty now. Just a forgotten napkin, a cracked plastic cup, and that pen. I stood at the doorway for a long moment, then walked over to the table, pulled out my phone again, and took a photo of the signature page. It was a small thing, but they'd missed the biggest detail of all. They assumed signing something made it real, but when you forge numbers to back a deal and submit that file digitally, it's not the pen that matters. It's the metadata. Later that night, I opened my laptop at home and created a folder labeled Active Review. Inside, I placed screenshots, metadata logs, and backup PDFs from my previous records. Records I'd saved quietly over the years, just in case someone forgot the difference between posturing and process. I didn't feel triumphant, just ready. They didn't just lie. They left a trail to prove they had. And no matter how many lawyers or bank logos or name cards they threw on a table, nothing could undo the fact that their confidence had written its own exposure. They thought the danger was losing the deal. They never considered what it meant to prove they were willing to cheat. The morning light came early and cold. I'd barely touched the coffee in my hand before my phone buzzed. Once, then again. Then again. Not random, not angry. Coordinated. I didn't answer the first call, or the second. By the fourth, I knew something had shifted. The first voicemail was from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. Hey, just wanted to check in. Heard some chatter. Hope everything's okay. Sounds like things have gotten weird. The second was from a former board member I'd met once at a gala. I've been hearing your name in some odd contexts lately. Thought you should know. The third was shorter. Don't let them pin this on you. Call me. I sat still in the car, engine off, radio silent, the scent of cooling coffee rising around me like a fog I didn't ask for. They weren't calling to warn me. They were calling because they didn't know what to believe, and that meant someone had already started telling them what to. I scrolled through texts, group chats I wasn't in, screenshots forwarded from colleagues, a photo of me cropped badly beside a headline. Disgruntled family member blocks estate progress. Not legally filed, not official, just circulated. It didn't need a judge to convict, just enough repetition to stick. And silence? Silence became agreement. I looked up across the parking lot. The restaurant was private, Darius's choice. Rourke had probably made the reservation. Family meeting. That's what the text said. No apology, no context, just a location and time. Inside, the host recognized my name and led me to the back. A private room, too small for comfort. The lights were soft, the table round. A pitcher of lemon water sat untouched in the center. 3 chairs, only 2 occupied. They'd arrived before me. Of course they had. Rourke was all teeth and bravado. "Glad you could join us." My father didn't speak. He just gestured to the 3rd chair like it hadn't been a performance from the start. I sat without comment. The conversation started with pleasantries that didn't land. Weather, coffee brands, a brief mention of some new hire I didn't know. Then Darius leaned forward. "You've always been thoughtful, Callan. Sensitive." It wasn't a compliment. It was preamble. Rourke picked it up fast. "We're hearing things about you, getting into things you don't fully understand." There it was, the version of the story where I was unstable, confused, dangerous, but only in the way that makes people shake their heads and say, "It's sad, really." I didn't respond. Darius folded his hands. "We're worried, for you. This isn't the path you want to go down." The phrasing was careful, just vague enough to echo as a warning. I could feel my pulse in my teeth. If I pushed back now, I'd look unhinged. If I waited too long, the paint would dry. That was the trap. Act, and you prove their point. Wait, and you become it. Rourke reached for his glass. "Nobody wants to see your name dragged through this." As if it hadn't already been uploaded, screenshotted, and weaponized. I stared at the condensation dripping down the side of his cup. 1 drop fell, then another. Neither of them noticed that I hadn't touched my water. "I'm not here to argue," I said finally. My voice was even, controlled. Darius exhaled. "Good. That's good." He relaxed, but too soon, because I wasn't done. "I'm just here to listen." And I did. I watched. Rourke leaned too far back, smug in his confidence. Darius kept checking his watch, eyes darting away every time I made contact. They believed the narrative would hold. They believed I was here to be managed. But the silence I'd used to protect myself was now being used to suffocate me, and they thought I wouldn't notice. I left without shaking hands. Back in the car, I didn't start the engine right away. I sat with the weight of what I now understood. The truth would take time, and the lie already had a head start. But time was something I could still control. Silence had protected me once. Now it was time to decide what it would cost me to keep it. The hallway leading back to the main boardroom felt colder than it had that morning. Same polished floors, same glass. But now, every reflection looked sharper, like it was waiting for something to break. Inside, they were already seated. Rourke took the head of the table again, laughing over something said too loudly. My father stood beside him, shaking hands with the notary and the bank representative, performing a calm too deliberate to be real. The attorney on their payroll stood nearby, flipping through the folder I knew had been prepped with false confidence and half-truths. Everything mirrored the last time we'd sat in this room, except me. I walked in without being announced. No one looked up. That was their first mistake. I didn't go to the far wall this time. I took the chair they'd left vacant the last time, the one they'd pretended wasn't meant for me. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't need it anymore. The documents were already placed, pens uncapped and positioned carefully beside each signature line like weapons laid out for ceremony. A presentation folder rested before Rourke, bold red tabs sticking out from the side, color-coded for confidence. He tapped it like he couldn't wait to finish the job. "We've all reviewed the terms," he said to the room. "Everything is ready." His voice carried like it belonged there. He even smiled at the notary when he said it. I noticed his hand hovered over the final page, one signature away from closing a deal built on a forged foundation. He didn't know it yet, but he'd built his platform over glass, not stone. The bank rep adjusted her glasses and leaned in. "There is one point I need to confirm," she said, scanning her copy. "This bank statement from last quarter, who submitted this version?" Everyone froze. Just a moment, just long enough. Rourke's lips parted. "That came from accounting." The rep didn't nod. She didn't smile. She turned to the compliance officer at the end of the table, who quietly pulled out a folder of his own. Not the one from the family. His. "It appears," the officer said, "this document was uploaded from an unverified terminal, time-stamped 4 days ago, after access to the bank's secure portal had already been revoked." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Rourke let out a soft scoff. "That must be a mix-up. We've used the same access for years." But my father wasn't scoffing. He was staring at the page like he'd never seen it before. His jaw clenched. One hand reached up to adjust his tie, then stopped halfway. The rep spoke again, gently. "This would void the integrity of any transaction depending on this data." Silence fell like someone had turned off the air. I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. I opened the folder in front of me, my folder, and slid a different set of papers forward. "I anticipated there might be errors," I said. "So I've brought clarification, including controlling ownership, transferred 3 weeks ago. The notarized copy is with the state already." Rourke blinked. "What?" My father's mouth barely moved. "What did you say?" I met his eyes and said it evenly, without heat. "I own controlling interest. The shares were acquired from Ms. Linton before the merger talks, before any of this." The lawyer's hand paused mid-page. "That's not possible," Rourke said. "It's public record," I replied. My father pushed back from the table slightly, his chair groaning. The weight of his silence was heavier now than all his shouting used to be. "I told you," Rourke muttered, turning to him. "You said he couldn't—" "You forged the document," my father whispered. "You told me this was solid." "It is." "Stop." That voice wasn't mine. It wasn't angry, just tired. For a long moment, no one moved. The bank rep finally closed her folder and stood. "In light of the discrepancies, we will not proceed with this signing. Further legal review is required." They began to gather their things. Lawyer, notary, compliance officer, professional, efficient, detached. I stayed seated. So did Rourke. My father didn't sit. He stayed standing, one hand on the back of his chair as if it was the only thing keeping him upright. His eyes drifted to me, then away, then back again, like he wanted to say something but couldn't decide which man I'd become. The son, the opponent, the one he forgot to fear. "Callan," he started. I waited. He didn't finish. Maybe he remembered what he'd said in this same room the first time we gathered. When he called me the greatest disappointment of his life, maybe the words tasted different now, with no ground to stand on. I stood and gathered my folder. There was nothing left to say. As I walked out, the room behind me didn't speak. They thought the signature would save them. They never realized whose name mattered. The first day without a meeting, a message, or a deadline felt foreign, almost wrong. The kind of silence that used to signal danger now sat in my house like an old friend who'd finally taken off his shoes. I walked through the kitchen that morning slower than usual. No coffee brewing on the stove, no texts lighting up my phone, just the sound of the floorboard near the fridge creaking the same way it always had. For the first time in a long while, I didn't check my email before I sat down. There was nothing I was waiting on. No approvals, no counters, no damage control. They had signed everything, but not for me. They signed it thinking I was out of the way, irrelevant. I never corrected them. They never asked. 3 days had passed since the conference room showdown, since the signature that changed everything, but changed nothing at the same time. Legally, I had won. Publicly, they fell silent. And emotionally, well, that's the part no paper ever settles. I sat at the kitchen table with the same folder I'd used from the beginning, creased at the corners, one side slightly torn from where I'd flipped too quickly once. Inside were the early records, the old emails I'd forwarded to myself, copies of contracts they never thought I had access to. None of it mattered anymore, but I kept it open in front of me. Not to reread it, but to remind myself why I'd stopped asking for permission to matter. My phone buzzed once around 8:42 a.m. It was a voicemail from my father. I didn't play it. I didn't delete it either. I just stared at the screen until it went black again. I already knew what it would sound like. His voice carrying that familiar blend of controlled regret and just enough authority to sound like he still ran something. There wouldn't be an apology. Just some phrase like, "Let's not drag this further." Or worse, "What do you want now?" And the truth was, I didn't want anything. Not from him. Not anymore. Later that afternoon, I left the house for the first time in days. Just a short drive. I didn't even bring my wallet. I wasn't heading anywhere specific. I just needed to move. Something my therapist once called integration through motion. I'd laughed when she said it. Now I understood. As I pulled onto a back road lined with early spring trees, I realized I didn't have a single image in my head of the people I used to call family where they weren't trying to control something. Me. Each other. The story. Even Rourke, brash as he was, had only ever been swinging in the dark, hoping someone would call it leadership. The power plays, the signatures, the fake statements. They were his version of worth. And my father? He clung to legacy like a drowning man gripping a stone. It had to be preserved, even if it meant burying everyone who challenged it, including me. The road opened into a clearing where I sometimes used to run. I parked the car, stepped out, and walked until the sound of the highway faded. Just wind and gravel under my shoes. There was no one to impress out here, no scripts to rehearse, no versions of me to defend. I remembered sitting at that signing table, watching the notary hesitate, her glance at the bank representative, the moment their confidence cracked. Not because I shouted, but because I didn't. Because silence, the thing they once used to dismiss me, had become the only thing louder than their schemes. But silence had changed. Back then, it was a survival tactic. Now it was a choice. There were things I didn't say when it all ended, truths I could have thrown like grenades. I let them keep their version of events for the public. It wasn't mercy. It wasn't pride. It was freedom. I didn't need them to confess. I didn't need them to apologize. I didn't even need them to know I was right. Because in that stillness, walking between the trees, I felt something I hadn't in years. Untangled. Some days that would feel like loneliness. But not today. Today, it felt like peace. When I got back to the car, another message blinked on my screen. This one from a distant cousin, someone who'd been too busy during the family meltdown, but suddenly wanted to reconnect. I deleted it before it finished loading. I knew where that road led. I'd already walked it. I didn't need to walk it again just to prove I'd survived. Back home, I made tea instead of coffee. I left my phone on the counter and sat in the sunroom where the light hit just right. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just enough. There's something about aging, not in the body, but in the soul, that teaches you what to carry and what to put down. I used to carry the idea that if I just proved myself enough, they'd see me. That if I waited long enough, someone would say, "You were right. We were wrong." But that kind of recognition is its own trap. It keeps you chained to the hope that the people who hurt you might become the people who heal you. They don't, and that's okay. I didn't win my family back. I won something harder, the right to stop trying. Have you ever walked away from something you once fought to keep? If this story felt familiar, I'd like to hear yours.